Hello, and welcome to the first main lecture of this semester, The Rise of an Industrial Society in the West, also known as Unit 2. So, you have just completed Unit 1 of the course. You spent some time meditating on my first lecture and on the videos by John Fia and the ideas of how historians think and what historians do. So, using all of that as pretense, as an understanding moving forward in the course before we revisit again at the end. I want you to keep that in mind as we move forward because now we are going to get into the meat of our class, into the meat of our era. And what better place to start than with industrialism? Now, industrialism actually begins before our era. This class is from 1900 to 1945, but industrialism will take us back another 150 or so years. And we won't be getting into all the minor and minute little details in that period because it takes us far out of our scope. But we cannot begin to understand the importance of the 20th century, especially our little sliver of the 20th century, without first understanding industrialism. Because industrialism really is the foundation of the entire 20th century. For the purposes of our lecture, and really for the purpose of this entire class, when I say the West in quotes, the areas highlighted in red are the West. So we include Western and Eastern Europe, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Canada, among a few other smaller places as well. But that's really what I say, really what I mean when I say the West. Technically, yes, Mexico is in the West, but we're not really talking about a geographic construct here. We're talking about a kind of a cultural construct. And what the West really symbolizes is where liberalization, private property ownership, and elements of capitalism begin to rise. And we'll talk more about this as we move through the rest of the semester. This is our lecture outline for, well, this lecture. So be aware, this is how I sort of divided up the lecture here. These are terms that you should be aware of. If not, you should fully write them down. And this is our big question for the week. And this big question will be featured in our discussion board for this week. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So I've already alluded to it before, but let's talk about the major importance of industrialism. So the entire 20th century can be considered an industrial century. Take a moment and think of all the major events that you can think of and all of the important things that just come in off the top of your mind. Think about the clothing that you wear, the stereo system that you own, the television that you watch. Think of the wars. Think of really anything. And think about how it relates to industrialism. If you think about it, virtually everything, including the things in this picture, are connected in some way to industrialism. Without industrialism, the world as we know it today, indeed the section of the class that we're going to talk about, would not be the same at all. So do not exaggerate when I say that industrialism is by far the most important thing that we will talk about in this class because it is foundational for every unit that comes afterwards. And hopefully as we move forward, unit by unit, you'll see how I've sequenced them and that they all kind of tie back to each other and they all tie back to industrialism. The Industrial Revolution in the West begins in Great Britain. No doubt you've talked about this before in high school because I would assume still that the Industrial Revolution is quintessential learning. Every class at some point studies the Industrial Revolution and what comes out of it. And so this class will be no different. And bear in mind that we do have two additional videos for this week. One is on the Industrial Revolution, and the other is on capitalism and socialism. So while I will talk about those things in this video, those videos will provide additional details that I'm not going to get into. So, what I'm going to give you here is kind of the bare bones I want you to take into account, what I want you to write down and pay attention to. And the other videos will provide supplemental information that will greatly enhance your understanding of these topics and events. Great Britain really is the epicenter of industrialism, especially in the West. And there's a number of reasons for that, some of which I don't get into entirely. I did not set up the slides for them. But if I freestyled for a second, industrialism in Great Britain really is possible because it's an island. It's not particularly large. So it has a sufficient population that is able to work in mills and factories, as we have up here. And they have a large network of navigable rivers that go to all areas of the island. The southern part near the English Channel, towards Ireland, towards the North Sea. And you can move goods in and out of the island fairly easily because of these navigable rivers. Great Britain also has a large deposit of coal in easily accessible locations, and coal is necessary to fire the plants that are used to manufacture goods. Great Britain will build large scale factories like the one up in the top left, and eventually they will create the steam engine and the steam engine itself, the engine that could be applied to anything. And then, most famously, the steam engine that is placed on what is a locomotive down here. All of this comes from Great Britain. And later, over time, the Industrial Revolution will spread to Canada, North America, to the continent of Europe, where these ideas of the factory, the locomotive, will all be refined and added to with new inventions. Things like the light bulb by Thomas Edison here in the United States, or also an American, Alexander Graham Bell and his telephone. And then other things on top of this too. The Wright brothers and their bicycle manufacturing, as well as their more famous airplanes, all come out of various eras of the Industrial Revolution. In that case, specifically the second, but we'll get to that when we get to it. So the first Industrial Revolution, the starting point is a little bit debatable, but certainly the 1750s and 1760s, you're seeing hints of the Industrial Revolution, mainly in the textile industry. The British were beginning to set up weaving plants or textile mills where water power would turn wheels, large wheels that would hook to a crankshaft inside a mill. And I have a picture of this I'll show you on the next slide, that would spin machines that would weave cloth and weave fabric. And so this was sort of the first movement towards automation. And later on, when the steam engine was developed, steam power would be used to spin these wheels, to spin these crankshafts, and weave cloth at an even faster rate without the need to use river power. So it would become a faster and faster industry. So you would go from small mill operations centered, nestled on the bank of a river, to a very large factory complex like this that relied on coal in order to turn these wheels and turn these mechanisms to spin and weave cloth. So the Industrial Revolution really kicks off because, or in the I'm sorry, I had a brain cramp, in the little realm of textile weaving. So it's all about clothing. But it's made possible because of the accessible amounts of coal that I talked about before. So there's a bit of a coal revolution in Great Britain. And during this time, you have a large population of people in the countryside that don't really have much to do. They're typically farmers, but there are too many people living in Great Britain now. So you will see a large mass migration of people from the rural countryside into urban areas like London, Manchester, and Birmingham, who will take up residences in the cities in order to work in these fledgling new textile mills. At the same time, because you are producing more and more materials, you have markets where you can sell those goods to other people. You're no longer making textiles just for the people in your little region. You're making textiles for people, as many people as you can make textiles for, whether they are in the United States or France or Australia. In addition, what makes Great Britain very different from previous eh, industrial esque type movements is that there is a large influx of private money from people who are wealthy. These would be people who are dukes and earls and barons. So they're nobility, but they're not royalty. They're not using the state money. They're not using the nation's own money. They're using their own private wealth to build canals and eventually railroads and to invest in these mills and other factories in order to earn a profit. And that should sound familiar to you because it is the beginnings of industrial capitalism, which is what we have today. Yes, we may be a post-industrial state, but that basic concept is still there. Whether you are investing in a textile mill or you're investing in a computer company, that concept of industrial capitalism and modern finance is very much still in play today. So here's a picture of the inside of a textile mill. You have these very large wheels here. They're all hooked together with belts, and you can't see the crankshafts. The crankshafts are these sprockets here that have cylinder wheels on the side that spin, that turn other belts, that turn these wheels, and they spin cloth and fabric, things that are hooked to looms. And essentially, all the factories in Great Britain at this time, regardless of what they made, looked fairly similar. They all featured these very large wheels, these crankshafts, and lots of people on the factory floor moving about, taking finished product from one section of the factory to another where it can be further worked on and eventually sent out for sale. With industrialism, especially as rapid and as broad as the Industrial Revolution was, there was a need for raw materials. And this is especially true as the revolution begins to spread and get larger and go into its second phase, which is later on in the late 19th century, mostly concurring with our period. There's a need for gold, silver. There's a need for different types of wood, for coal, eventually oil, eventually natural gas, all the materials required to either make things or to run the machinery that makes things. So, coal and oil would run machines, give power to them. Cotton, different types of wood, different types of expensive stones would be things that you could fashion with those machines into things that you would sell, whether it's necklaces or clothing or anything like that, guns, for example. So, there's a need for raw materials. And this is a very important point. Great Britain, for example, I pointed out to you, is an island, so it's not particularly large. They do have coal there. They do have lumber there, although they go through it pretty quick. They have resources. But in order to continue to mass produce goods, whatever they are, they need to have new resources. Now, how do they get new resources? Well, the first way they can do this is through trade. They can trade that cloth, that fabric, that clothing, whatever they're making, to say the United States or to France for things that they can get back to make other things, whether it's gold or silver, exotic wood or whatever. But the other way, and what will become the more popular way, is through imperialism and colonialism. And we'll talk about the differences in a few units from now. But countries like Great Britain, France, United States will use colonies and harvest raw materials from those colonies in order to manufacture new goods that they can sell to themselves, to other countries, or back to the colony in what is referred to as mercantilism. For those of you who have taken an American history class before, the British used to do this with us when we were part of their colonial possessions. We grew cotton, we grew or mined for certain materials. We sold it to British merchants on the island, so sent all those things over to Britain, where they were manufactured into usable items and then sold back to us. It's not really a free market, it's a closed system because we were forbidden to trade with other countries. And so this is called mercantilism. The capitalism that's going to rise at this period is going to be more free market capitalism and industrialism, but it's still going to rest on colonialism and colonial possessions. I don't want to get into too much detail right now, but let me give you two examples. The first is with Great Britain. They still have Commonwealth holdings in Canada, Australia, and they hold India as its territory. And so they can take goods from India, like exotic silks and cotton. They can take exotic woods from Australia or coal from Canada, and they could manufacture those things on the island and sell it back to these places as well as to the United States and anybody else that wanted them. So that's one example. Another example would be, say, the United States. The United States takes over places like Hawaii and Puerto Rico and Cuba and grows agricultural products like bananas and pineapples. And they sell those things to themselves and also to other parts of the world. So this is going to be a big deal. So, in short, industrialism is going to lead to new innovations, new markets, but also a demand for resources. And new resources means new colonies and the rise of colonialism and imperialism. These are places where you not only get raw materials for your manufacturing, but you also have essentially a market that you're holding hostage that you can sell those goods back to. And we'll talk more about that when we get to imperialism. Let's talk about the spread of industrialism. So the second industrial revolution really kicks off in the 1870s, and the second industrial revolution is a worldwide affair, or at least a Western worldwide affair, whereas the first was mainly in Great Britain, with only touches of it in the United States, say in New England, where there is a growing textile industry in Connecticut and Massachusetts. The United States was mostly left out. It isn't until after the Civil War where you get massive industrialization in the United States, Canada, France, and parts of Germany. And this will be a very different kind of industrial revolution from the first. Whereas the first mainly focused on the creation of the steam engine, the use of coal and textiles, the second will refine a lot of these touches from the first revolution and expand them. We're going to look at heavy metal industries like steel and aluminum, heavy mining for not only coal and gold and silver, but also copper and different types of metals that would be smelted and used for various types of metal making. We're going to see a transportation revolution with the improvement of railroad technology and canals, eventually the airplane as well. We will see mass communication in the form of the telegraph and the wireless telegraph, and improvements in science and medicine, specifically and eventually with things like vaccines and antibiotics, although those come a little bit later. In all of these industries, or at least a good portion of them, we will also see mass production through the assembly line, precision machining, and the rise of a much more all encompassing market economy where people are free to sell and purchase goods on an open market, mostly in the first world countries. And by first world countries, let me back up. I mean these countries. These would be the first world countries that are not colonial possessions. They are free countries. They're first world countries. I can't explain it any better than that. We're going to see a lot of developments in France and Germany. but some of the most important ones are going to come right here out of the United States. Two things that are going to come out here, we have the rise of the automobile, and what showcases or what makes it possible is the mass production system, or what is also known as Fordism. The idea that you can take a very complicated system and lay it out into simple, step by step, incremental production steps in order to produce something at a very rapid speed and at a much, much lower cost. In other words, a much more efficient system. And you can see examples of the production assembly line here in both pictures. But let's look at it in more detail. So here are the key American contributions to the second industrial revolution and industrialism overall: the assembly line, scientific time management, interchangeable parts, and precision machining. Now, you can take a moment and pause this so you can write this down, but I'll just go through and just read off of it and do a little freestyle explanation. The assembly line is pretty straightforward. We just saw this a moment ago. The assembly line is where a large factory system is arranged with different parts laid out for a complicated system given to individual workers. Now, let's use the automobile as an example. Before the assembly line, if you built a car, you would go to a garage where maybe 10 people would work on your car, and all of them would just sit around and put wheels on the engine. They would make it all by hand. But this was too costly and too time consuming, and every vehicle would be a little bit different. The assembly line took massive amounts of workers, taught them how to do one or two things, and just sent the vehicles down a conveyor belt, one right after the other. And these workers went from being artisans and craftsmen to essentially cogs, machines themselves, human machines that would put on a single nut, a single bolt, a single screw, put on a tire, a wheel, a frame, over and over and over again, one right after the other. If that person got sick or injured, you replaced them, and the system kept going. The speed was quite impressive. The costs were much lower. Scientific time management is a social theory where that seeks to maximize the efficiency and minimize waste. An example of this is, why give one of your employees a 30-minute break when you can give them a 15-minute break? Interchangeable parts actually exist in the United States in the 1700s, and it comes out of the need to use as much material to use something over and over again in order to minimize costs. So let's say you have a machine that uses sprockets, and that machine, the sprockets are little gears, little wheels, and that machine makes, I don't know, it makes farm equipment. But let's say you actually need to make something else. Say you need to make uh, machine guns for a war. All you have to do is take those sprockets out, retool all of the machines, kind of switch them around, move different pieces around, switch the belts around, put those sprockets back in place. And all of a sudden, you have a factory that went from making farm equipment to making machine guns. So interchangeable parts, very important. And finally, precision machining. Now, this one's always a little bit hard for people to get their minds around, but all precision machining are machines that make machines for other machines, if that makes any sense. So think of a machine whose only job it is to make screws or sprockets or screw heads and machine heads that go into other machines that make other things. It sounds kind of meta. It's a little bit difficult. You can look up a better definition than what I gave you. But by making parts, by using machines that make machines for other machines, you could produce more equipment at a faster rate and build larger and larger and larger factories much, much quicker. A couple of social things that come out of the Industrial Revolution, especially in the United States, but also Great Britain, is the rise of a middle class. Now, it's going to be small at first, It takes some time to grow, and it doesn't grow easily. But as things are made faster and faster and more efficiently, prices begin to fall. And so, what was considered to be only something owned by the wealthy, say a decade before, now a lot of people are able to own it themselves. An automobile is one thing, also new clothing, shoes, belt buckles, ties, musical equipment. All of these things are mass produced at a greater rate and become cheaper and more accessible to others, forming a middle class. Also, like I said, people who invest their money or some people who work in these plants, especially people who have union jobs, they get paid very well and are able to save up that money and begin to buy their way into a new class. Look what we have here. We have a dry goods store filled with all sorts of things, um, beauty products, hair gel, toothbrushes, toothpaste, tobacco, cigars, all sorts of things that would have been very hard to get your hands on are now available to the masses at a much cheaper rate. And over here, a department store where you could buy jewelry, ladies' shoes, ladies' dresses, suits and ties that are tailor made, or suits and ties that are already made and are bought what is called off the rack, where you just go in, try it on, and walk out with it. This is all very, very new and only comes about because of the Industrial Revolution. But with all the good and positive things that you get out of industrialism, you also get a lot of negative things as well. And perhaps the most prominent of them is conflict between the classes. Industrialism, as you can imagine, leads to mass employment in these factories. And these people, as I pointed out before, are not always treated well. They eventually become machines in the eyes of their owners, machines that need to be controlled through time management, machines that are given 16, 17, even 18 hours of work to do. And if these people are injured, they are simply replaced, and the person who is injured is thrown out on their ear. They are paid very low wages, and they have to fight for the improvement of those wages over time. So, as urban areas begin to sprawl and industrial districts are built, you have people moving from the countryside into these urban areas, and there is really no place for them to live. So they live in housing that is very substandard, built very quickly, does not have any of the amenities that were common at the time, and you have a lot of infestation, a lot of disease, and a lot of crime that goes with it as well. They really do live in the slums for the period. If you look at this map, you'll see, for example, on the left, the urban density in Great Britain prior to massive industrialization. So you see that there really aren't a lot of places on the island where there was a heavy amount of people who lived in a small area. They were mostly spread out over the entire region. But by 50 years later, you have the beginning of large urban centers in Edinburgh and Glasgow, in London, Sheffield, Birmingham. These areas become massively, massively larger in population, and the rapid growth of these cities does not allow for sufficient building, sufficient urban planning to allow for them. So you have slums, you have people in poverty, you have high mortality rate, filth, lots and lots of filth. If any of you are familiar with A Christmas Carol, the Charles Dickens classic, have seen any version of it, any traditional version of it, the air in London was filled with soot. These places where these people lived were typically built right around the factories in these urban districts. Lots of prostitution, lots of filth, crime, murder, drunkenness, alcoholism, high mortality rates. These were not good places to live. And so there was a backlash of this with people who were trying to improve their societies. Much to the detriment of the factory owners who did not want to share as much of their wealth or improve the standing of these cities. You also had massive immigration. The United States, for example, will be the largest destination for these mass migrations, but also Canada and Australia. You're going to have immigrants from Britain, Wales, and Ireland, but also Italy, Greece, Germany, France, Spain, mostly on the East Coast, and Japan and China on the West Coast. And they're going to add uh, to the population growth in these places, making cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Cleveland, Detroit go from being mid-sized towns to gigantic metropolises with uh, large populations. Again, poverty, uh, disease, pollution, and also a strong cultural diversity, very different from other parts of these countries where you have little Italies and Slavic villages and Chinatowns, where they become little countries of themselves, lots of crime and lots of racial and ethnic tension in these communities between people from different parts of the world, all fighting amongst themselves for what wages and things existed for their benefit. So this was not a peaceful time. There was a lot of opportunity, to be sure, but it came at a very expensive price, a very steep price. A lot of violence, religious violence, ethnic violence, racial violence, and a lot of people barely scraping by to hopefully give their children something to aspire to later. One other positive thing to mention that comes out of this is the role of women. And I won't be getting into this too terribly much, but women were, as they are in any era, it seems, largely confined to the home. And we're going to see this change several times. We're going to see it at change after World War One, and during World War One. We're going to see it change during and after World War Two. And it also happens during industrialism, specifically the second industrial revolution. Women will work in the factories. They will work alongside their children who are in child labor, essentially. But they will also begin to take jobs in new fields that really did not exist. For example, those department stores I mentioned before, women are going to be sellers and customer service reps in these new department stores, mainly working with women, but also working with men. They will become personal shoppers. They will become telephone operators for the new telephone systems that are being installed. They will operate switchboards. They will operate they will perform different clerical aspects in the new industries that are coming, the new industries and the new factories that are being built in both Great Britain, Europe, and North America. So there are women beginning to work outside the home in both lower working class positions and, I guess, what we would say middle class positions, doing work that is very important and allowing them to get out into the world and to have spendable income that will enable them to not only provide for their families, but also to purchase other things that stimulate the economy further, purchasing washers and dryers, purchasing new clothing, purchasing maybe even an automobile. This is becoming, again, part of the greater market economy. And although women are going to still be considered subservient to men in society, this will begin to accelerate that change towards a greater woman's role in society, and in many ways accelerates the feminist movements in these countries as women begin to demand more and more rights and eventually representation in their governments. An important point to turn to is nationalism, because throughout this movement, throughout this development, we have innovations at the technological level, we have social changes going from rural to urban, the movement of immigrants, and we have women moving into the workforce. But in addition to this, we also have imperialism and colonialism, as I said before, the search for new markets for their goods and new markets or new areas for raw materials, new places, new sources of raw materials. And the combination of these things leads to a rise in nationalism. Now, what is nationalism? So there is a link that I have here. There is a link here in our unit. There's a short, very, very short piece. It's not more than maybe 3 paragraphs on the difference between nationalism and patriotism. But to make a long story short, nationalism is a hyper sensitive, hyper, almost insanely hyper version of patriotism. It's not enough to simply love your country, but it's a desire to see your country dominate its neighbors, and the belief that your country, the country that you love so much, also has superior qualities to your neighbors, whether they're ethnic, religious, racial, cultural, doesn't matter. So you want to dominate your neighbors, and you want to exert control over them, and you believe you are superior to them. And you can see where I'm going with this, because as this feeling begins to take hold, countries are going to begin to bicker among each other, bicker among their neighbors, try to dominate each other. And also, they will take this mindset into these foreign territories searching for raw materials, and they will use this nationalism to justify that. So, not only do they need raw materials for their factories, but now they feel entitled to go into these places like Ethiopia and Egypt and South America because they are superior and they have the right to do so. So keep that in mind. Here we have presented before us Germany and Italy. Now we are all familiar with Italy and we are all familiar with Germany. But what you might not be familiar with is that really prior to our era, they did not exist as countries. They were individual nation states. Germany, for example, was made up of Prussia, Bavaria, Hesse. Where's Hesse? Hesse's down here. Hanover, Saxony, and Austria was actually part of this too. And it took the sheer force of a very powerful family, mainly in Prussia, to conquer and unify all of these territories and eventually create what we now know today as Germany in the 1880s. They tried to conquer Austria, but it didn't work. So now Austria is its own separate country. If it wasn't for that little war that Prussia was not able to win, Austria would actually be part of Germany as well, because Austria is Germanic. They just call themselves Austria. And Italy doesn't fully unify until the 1870s, I believe, when finally it is able to be unified under one single authority. Because before that, Italy simply was Torino or Turin. You had Sicily, Sardinia, Rome, Tuscany with Florence. These all had to be united. And there's an old saying, I forget who said it, but there's an old saying that said, now that we have an Italy, we have to create Italians. Because there was no consciousness of what it meant to be Italian. Because there really were no Italians. There were only people from these individual kingdoms who were now united, and presto, now they're Italian, whatever that means. To be fair, we have the same arguments among ourselves. What exactly is it to be an American? Because we have Chinese, we have Irish, we have Germans, we have African Americans, and we have all these different people, as well as the traditional English who had settled here long before. Who exactly was an American, and was anybody more American than anybody else? It's a question that they were hammering out at the time, and to be fair, it's one that we're still dealing with today. You have other nations too, or kingdoms. The Ottoman Empire, for example, was one of the largest Muslim empires, and it still exists at this point, although it was much smaller because it was on the decline. The Ottoman Empire, who we'll go back to because they play a role in World War I, and what comes out of the empire will make for the modern Middle East, and we'll talk about that later. The Ottoman Empire used to stretch all the way over to Morocco and all the way over up into Bulgaria, almost in Austria, and down the perimeter of the Arabian Peninsula. But by the time that our period really gets going here, it's mostly just a little bit of Greece, Turkey, modern day Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Israel, and all the way down until you get to Yemen. So pretty much the Arabian Peninsula. And eventually what you have here are nation groups within this kingdom: Turks, Arabs, Jews, Persians, Kurds, Greeks, Slavs in Bulgaria, all these different types of people that were once held together by one mighty empire. As that empire weakens, these people begin to rise up and fight for their own individual nation state. A Greek nation for the Greeks, a Turkish nation for the Turks, an Arab nation for the Arabs, a nation for the Jews, Israel. And the same thing happens in Europe too. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, made up of Austria and Hungary, as well as Bosnia, Romania, they're all going to get their own national consciousness and begin to break up as well. We'll hold that discussion though until we get to World War One. But there's so many dynamics going on because of industrialism, the massive amounts of trade, the imperialism, the class conflict, the national consciousness, the desire to invade other countries, to seize resources and spread one's own culture. All of this comes about mainly because of industrialism. The same thing happens here on the United States side with Latin America. There are British and Dutch and French over in this area, but mainly by our period, the United States is running the show, and we will take part in various wars in Mexico, in Cuba, in Haiti, San Domingue, places like that, Puerto Rico, and we will foment revolutions and rebellions and exert our influence over these places so we can control the sugar trade, the cotton production, the production of exotic agricultural goods, and control trade, as well as to exert our influence on these countries and try to spread American capitalism, American religion, American culture into these areas and control them. So we are not free from this as well. Perhaps the most famous thing, or the two most famous things that come out of this, are the Spanish-American War in 1898, where we seize Cuba, uh, San Domingue, Puerto Rico, the Marshall Islands, which are in the Pacific, and we seize the Philippines as well, and Guam. And in 1903 and 1909, we are able to foment a revolution in the northern part of Colombia that eventually separates and becomes the country of Panama, where we build the Panama Canal. So that is one of our major contributions in this sense. And we're going to talk more about this later on when we get to imperialism. The final thing that we're going to talk about is socialism. So there is a separate video on socialism and capitalism. So by all means, do watch that for a much more specific and detailed discussion of the two. But suffice it to say that with all of the class conflict going on, and eventually it spreads to the racial tensions too, that there is a rise in class consciousness and a desire to overthrow was considered to be a predatory capitalist system that's preying on workers, stealing resources, and giving very little in return. And some of the readings that we have this week discuss matters of this. We have one reading about the rules of a factory. Another reading is from a man by the name of Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was a Pittsburgh steel tycoon who was a very wealthy man, and also known to be quite ruthless in his factory operations, but who was also sympathetic and wanted to combat socialism and social inequality by giving large sums of his money away. And then the other piece that we have is written by an American economist, Henry George, on the problems of inequality in the United States. And all of these stem from industrial capitalism and the industrial system. But socialism aimed to solve this in a different way, whereas Henry George, as you will read, talks about needing additional regulations and social reform. And Andrew Carnegie talks about giving vast sums of his wealth away through philanthropy, and also using a death tax and estate tax to take money away from those who don't do the same, to create more schools and things like that to help people. Socialism aimed to through the mechanism of revolution, to create a system of government in which wealth was redistributed between the classes in order to create a more equitable society. It stems from the writings of Karl Marx, the man pictured over here on the left, and Friedrich Engels, pictured over here on the right. Marx was a German, and Engels was a man from Great Britain, a factory owner himself. And they saw the world in a series of superstructures and through class. And they believed that history and all of the important events of the world turned not on culture, turned not because of culture, not because of religion, but because of class. So you had hunter-gatherer societies, and then those evolved to feudalistic societies, and those evolved to constitutional type monarchical societies, and then those evolved into societies with mercantilism, and then capitalism, and industrial capitalism, and eventually, because of the growing wealth and the growing wealth inequality and the rise of resources being taken by different people, you would have the creation of a worker consciousness that would snap through revolution, and people would overthrow this minority that has control over them and take control of the resources and the means of production and create a much more equitable society. That was what their belief was. So I want you to pause this video. I'm not going to read all of this, but I want you to pause this video and take this down in your notes to really understand the difference between socialism and capitalism. Now, I want to add one thing here, that socialism is not necessarily communism. Communism is a state in which uh, the entire government commands all aspects of the economy. Socialism does not necessarily call for that, but it does call for programs or systems put in place to regulate aspects of the economy, regardless of the market, in order to ensure an equitable distribution of wealth, whether it's equal redistribution or just a better distribution of wealth. There are different types of people who have different views of socialism. Henry George, for example, is a left-leaning libertarian, and while he's not a socialist, he is a major proponent of capitalism, but he is also a major proponent of different types of regulations that would ensure an equitable system of an equitable economic system. But he was not a socialist. So it does get very complicated. But for our purposes here, just freeze this, write this down, and as we move forward, we'll talk a little bit more about communism when it comes to the Russian Revolution. Here's a wonderful little cartoon that kind of talks about this. It's amusing. Just look at it and think about it. Capitalism is described by capitalists, capitalism described by socialists, socialism described by capitalists, socialism described by socialists, so on and so forth. Just take a look at it, enjoy it for the humor that it offers, but there is some truth to it. So let's conclude. So industrialism. So what do we get out of industrialism that's good? We have modern industrial capitalism and finance, mass production and innovation, lower costs on goods and services, more wealth distributed among the people. So you have different classes because of that. You have an upper class, you have an aristocracy, you have an upper class, you have a upper middle class, a lower middle class, a working class, the lower class and the poor. You have lower mortality rates, believe it or not. You have new goods, new markets, new inventions, and you have the rise of cosmopolitan cities. So these are, and many more things, but these are some of the key things that we talked about here. But you also have overcrowding in the urban areas, mass immigration, which in itself is not a bad thing, but mass immigration that is really more forced than what's desired. People don't necessarily want to leave, but they have no choice to leave. More overcrowding because of immigration, as well as internal migrant movement. Inequitable gaps of wealth between classes. So you have you have wealth highly concentrated at the top with less and less of it going down to the bottom. Even though there is more wealth being spread around, you have because of flip back here, because you have a lower mortality rate, you have more people living longer and more people having children. And so while wealth is being spread around to different classes and new classes are being created, you still have large numbers of people, massive numbers of people who are in terrible poverty, working 16-hour jobs, children doing extreme child labor, and people whose lives are being micromanaged by people at the top. Class conflict because of this, in the form of factory workers or factory owners spying on their workers, firing their workers for various reasons, working them virtually to death. Also on the worker side, union movements, trade union movements, chaining themselves to machines, sit down strikes, things like that. All of this is really brewing because of industrial capitalism. And the last 2 points are important: imperialism and colonialism, and social Darwinism and the idea of superiority. So, imperialism and colonialism, I talked about this, the need for raw materials, more raw materials, larger markets, and more places to trade and sell, really uh, obligate these countries to begin to seize other countries or other places in order to draw those materials and resources and to sell those new products, creating larger and larger empires, the United States included. And I did hint to social Darwinism a few moments ago, with this idea, with these new innovations and this new wealth and these powerful factory owners going into these places, taking land, taking resources, modernizing their militaries. You also have the belief that certain people, especially ethnicities and countries, cultures, nations, races, white people, English people, Americans, are just naturally superior to people who are brown, people who aren't Christian, people who come from what we call today the third world. And so all of these things link together and really perpetuate into a world out of control, where first world nations like Germany, France, Great Britain, the United States are always in conflict with each other over who's stronger and who's better. So they have trade wars, or they have actual wars like World War One, or you're going to have nationalistic fighting like what happens in Bosnia, what happens in the Middle East, or you're going to have wars or conquest in the name of ethnic superiority and cultural superiority. What happens in India? What happens in South America? So all of these things we're going to discuss going back or going forward, I should say, whether it's Darwinism, social Darwinism, uh, imperialism in Asia and Africa, the First World War. So many of these things all tie back to the Industrial Revolution. So enjoy the videos for the rest of this week. Enjoy the readings. Our first PSA is due. Look at the directions on that. And I believe there's a video that accompanies that too by one of my colleagues. We also have a quiz this week, only 10 questions, and feel free to contact me if you have any additional questions. I hope you enjoyed this lecture and have a good rest of the week.